It'd help if I turn on the mic. So, this is just a recap for those who are watching online. This is the third part in our Samson series, and Samson is this celestial guy. He works from a place of doing goodness. And then last week we had the part where he's putting together this riddle for the Philistines. He says, if you can answer my riddle, I'll give you these 30 garments. But what ends up happening is Samson's wife gives the answer to the Philistines after she nags Samson for it. But this week, to me, is where the story really kind of comes together and we start to understand what's really going on. Because as I'm painting this picture, is the Philistines are this big problem. And the problem is that they represent a life where you know what the right thing to do is, but you don't actually do it. You do whatever you want because it feels good. You want to just do whatever you want, you do that. But you know what the right thing is. And that's an alluring place for us to be. That's the wife, not Delilah yet. That's the wife of Samson. She's alluring, she's attractive. We want that. So Samson is susceptible to that kind of life. I can know what the right thing to do is, but not actually do it. But because Samson doesn't rationalize things, he's also the one thing that can overcome it. He can't be tricked through reasoning into do it. But his weakness is that he does have a desire for it. That's the fundamental flaw with Samson. He can succumb to his desire. When we see these stories, it's the wife who nags him. And I think we undersell it by saying nagging, because in our life, sometimes we just have this urge, this craving, oh, I really want that. And that's where the weakness is. We just said with a previous talk that, love of self is the most delightful thing. Well, that's the problem Samson's facing here. Love of self. Oh, I just want to do this. But where I want to bring this chapter for today is anytime you get involved in something that's kind of a habit and something that goes towards addiction, there's a place where the addiction or the habit loses its fun. And that's what happens today for Samson. He's into something, and all of a sudden, the delight is lost. And what happens when you lose the delight for something? You actually have the ability to fight against it. How many times has somebody been an alcoholic, they've been in on the drink, and one day, one night, one weekend, they have a bad experience with it. They said something they shouldn't have, they got in a fight with somebody, they got thrown in jail, they lost their money, their wife ran out. All sorts of bad things can happen when you're stuck on alcohol. And at that point, it stops being fun. You wake up in the morning, you go, oh my gosh, what have I done? And for the first time, the person has the ability to fight against it, going, oh, you know what? This isn't right. I'm going to fight against this pattern in my life and go against it. And this, to me, is what this chapter in Judges about Samson is about. So let's go through this chapter. We'll kind of pick it apart, and then I'm going to tie it back into somebody's story about their addiction and it not being any fun. So here we go. This is Judges chapter 15. After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, let me go into my wife, into her room. But her father would not permit him to go in. Her father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines when I do evil to them. Then Samson went and caught 300 foxes. He took his torches and turned the foxes tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. The Philistines then said, "Who's done this?" And they answered, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Samson said to them, "Since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease." So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Now the Philistines went up, encamped in Judah, and deployed themselves against Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" So they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson, to do him as he has done to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." But they said, "We have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." Then Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." So he spoke to them, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they bound him with new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and reached out of his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men. Then Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he called that place Ramah Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned and revived. And therefore he called its name En-Hakkor, which is Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. All right, so it's quite a story, but excuse me. If you look at the story, what's the big deal? What's the turning point for Samson? He loses the wife, right? He goes to get his wife, and the wife is removed. She's taken from him. Nope, I've given her to somebody else. Well, what's the wife? The wife is the part of the Philistines that's attractive, that's alluring. It's the desire. It's the thing that I want. And when you've taken that away, what happens? Well, all hell breaks loose, kind of, right? This is what can happen for us. You know, we've been in a pattern, in a habit or whatever, something that we've been doing that's not right. And all of a sudden, when that evil finally starts to collapse on us and it stops being fun, we finally have the fortitude to stand up and fight against it. You know, I'm not going to take that alcohol anymore. I'm not going to, yell at that person anymore. I'm no longer going to be a jerk. You know, whatever it is. You know, sometimes you say, I'm going to write this nasty letter to somebody. And we go, oh, the next day, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That wasn't fun anymore, right? Finally, we can say, oh, now that I've done it, I can turn against it. And this is what's happened. The wife is gone. He can fight now. And we look at what happens here, right? You know, in verse 3 through 5 here, we have the foxes being caught. And that's craziness right there, right? How you catch 300 foxes, you tie them together and send them out with torches. Well, what is that a picture of spiritually? Well, foxes are a metaphor for cunning, right? Cunning, deceit, kind of like that. And in the scripture, when you bind something up, you are depriving it of its power. I mean, that's what you think about when they bind Samson later in the story. You bind him up, you're depriving Samson of his strength. At least that's what they thought. When Samson binds these foxes together, you know, can foxes still be cunning when they're tied up like that? No. They're fighting against each other. They're squirming around. You know, foxes live by sneaking around. Samson has taken the evil and said, you can no longer trick me. He puts a torch between the two tails, and a torch in this sense is about letting is about an evil desire. So the evil desire, I think lake of fire, right? Lake of fire is our desire. So here you have a torch. So he's, with the cunningness of evil taken away, the evil desire goes forth, and what does it do? It destroys everything. It destroys the grain, the vineyards, and the olive groves. Well, what do they represent? Well, the grain is about natural good, good things you do just because you're told to. The vineyards we know represents spiritual goodness, and then olive is the highest. Well, these are inverted because it's it's Philistine stuff. So it's all levels of evil actions. So evil that we've done just for being a jerk, evil that we do because we rationalize it, or love of the world and love of self. So when the evil is exposed, it goes through and it destroys everything. All the network of evil that you've built up comes collapsing down on itself because everything's turned against you. So Samson can finally fight against it and destroy all these evil actions. And then, of course, the Philistines aren't happy with this. So it goes from removing the wife to now they kill her. So now the delight in this process of being evil is really taking a hit. It's really not fun now because it's just extinguished. So what does Samson do then? It says he goes and attacks them hip and thigh. What Swedenborg talks about when it comes to hip and thighs, he says it's about a love of marriage, is what's going on there. So there's this love of marriage is about this marriage of goodness and truth. So he attacks them from a place of marriage, good and truth, which is the opposite of what Philistines are, which is the love of good and truth separated. So he's taking these different levels of kind of spiritual attack and saying, no, we are not going to just do or know what's right and not do it. I'm going to go and attack from a place of having the two wed together. I'm going to do what's right from a place of knowing what's right. So the Philistines, of course, they're not happy about this. They lose a lot of people, and they go to arrest him. 3,000 men of Judah went down. Judah, again, is this place of our desires on the good side of things. So it goes to that, and they try to bind Samson. They say, sure, you can have Samson. Off you go. They've bound him, so depriving him of his power. And what ends up happening is, well, Samson has more power than those ropes can handle. He comes through and wipes out these Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. So, what's a jawbone of a donkey represent, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because a jawbone, in general, is about an affection for interior truth. And then the donkey, it's about service. And what happens here is, you'll note that this happens at this cleft of the rock. What's a cleft of a rock? Well, a cleft of the rock is about, what the writings talk about is that it's a place of operating out of a very basic level of goodness. And the donkey is a very basic level of service. So as an example that we're given is when Jesus says, oh, you've been faithful in a few things, I'm going to make you rule over 5 cities. You've been faithful over many things, I'm going to make you rule over 10 cities. Some people believe that to be literally true. You're going to wake up in heaven and you're going to be ruler of cities. And so, Johnny says, well, I'm going to be a good guy in this life because I want to be a ruler over cities. I want to be ruler in heaven over all these things. That's an example of a cleft of a rock type place that you're operating from. I'm operating from a literal sense of the word that's basically good, but at the same time not actually a good place, a perfect place to be working from. So Samson, what we're seeing is that he operates from these different levels of goodness. The donkey, this very basic level of service. From this jawbone, he has some desire to know the truth. It's all coming together for him because he works from goodness, which is how you confront the Philistines, which are a desire to know and not do. I want to wrap this up here with an example that I found of a person's story on addiction to kind of tie it all together so you can kind of see how I think that what this story represents and what this chapter is about. And this person writes, she says, "My name is Lucy." She says, "I'm 29 years old and my primary addiction is alcohol. I've abused every kind of drug you can think of, but nothing has ever worked for me like alcohol did. In the past 4 or 5 years, substance abuse has completely ruled my life. I was a round-the-clock daily drinker who developed a heavy dependence on the substance. I used to think I was a functional alcoholic, but the truth is I simply couldn't function without it. Towards the end, I needed it to do everyday things. My tolerance was so high that although I eventually received little to no effect from it, I couldn't stand the withdrawals. So I kept going. I had a great upbringing. My parents are good people who worked hard to ensure that my brother and I had every opportunity to live happy and healthy lives. I wasn't raised a spoiled brat. I was told every night before bed how special, precious, and loved I was. For the longest time, though, I struggled with who I was internally and never felt really connected to myself or others. I knew my family only wanted me to be happy, and that society just wanted me to be normal, but somehow I always felt different, like I wasn't enough. I'm an extremist by nature. I hyper-focus on specific things and train myself from an early age to live in only 2 states of being: ultra-perfectionism and complete self-destruction. I was pretty good at both. As an adult, I felt like an outcast from society, like everyone else had some secret manual on how to live happy, normal lives, but I'd somehow missed the memo. And my primary purpose was a combination of wanting to feel good and simultaneously control the perception that others formed of me. I had no values of my own, no principles to live by, little integrity, and no self-worth. But there was no reason at all for me to be an addict. I was white, educated, heterosexual. I grew up in middle-class neighborhoods of a first-world country. I never endured any kind of discrimination, abuse, or trauma. I know how that sounds, but I want to make a point of saying it because I want to challenge society's description of an addict and the reasons why people become addicts. I functioned at high levels and appeared very normal by society's standards. However, inside, I just wanted not to die. In a weird kind of way, I was simply existing through life. I was in complete denial about my addiction for many years. I believed I had it all under control and I could stop whenever I wanted to. I convinced myself that as long as no one knew about it, it wasn't actually a problem. Alcohol was my solution to everything, though. It was the answer to all my internal problems and the tranquility to slow my busy mind. In the beginning, it worked fantastically. It just worked. And then it stopped working. It ran my life into the ground. All right? So I'm picturing this. This is the Philistines, right? For a while, it works. For a while it works, but then it stops working. The Israelites, the people of Judah, see that these Philistines are their taskmasters. Don't you realize, Samson, they rule over us? My life was a mess. I was caught in the aftermath of a toxic and dangerous relationship. I'd isolated myself from childhood friends and I was in serious financial hardship. My parents were supportive of a transition, but they knew I had to start somewhere fresh and clean to straighten out my life. So I was going to move, but I was still drinking every day, in secret, of course. My physical and mental health was beginning to deteriorate, but I kept on going, living in hope for my new sober life that I had promised myself would start as soon as I relocated. I had a brand new job to look forward to, a new apartment, new opportunities, new everything. It was all there waiting for me to rebuild. All I had to do was to stay sober. I knew that. But I couldn't. I remember the day I got the keys to my apartment. I had no furniture or anything. All my stuff was due to arrive on the delivery truck that afternoon. But I found myself sitting on the floor of my new living room with a carton of bourbon, cracking open a drink. I remember the insanity of it all hitting me then. How did this happen? I look back at it now and think, of course it did. I didn't know of any other way of processing my emotions, happy, sad, anxious, whatever. The solution was to drink. The next 6 months saw the real beginning of my downfall. Alcohol, the one thing that always worked for me, was beginning to work against me. She goes on, it's like it stops being fun. She fights it, she gets a little forward, and then she goes back. And she talks about how this keeps going, and every time she starts realizing, this isn't working for me anymore. It's no longer alluring. It's no longer attractive. I don't desire this. And it's through this that she finally breaks through, gets herself into rehab, and starts putting her life back together. This can happen with alcohol, but it can happen in our spiritual lives too. You know, love of self, love of the world, love of disobedience, all those things can be just as addictive. That's the whole point of the quote for the kids, where it was, there's nothing more delightful than love of self. We can get hung up and stuck into these things so well that we don't even realize it. But they're delightful. And eventually we can fight back against it once we've realized that that delight isn't real. It's not there. Maybe we realize it never was there. Or maybe it's gotten so bad that our life has fallen apart and the delight is actually gone. Things have gone that bad for us. But that's what Samson is there to fight against. He's there once that delight has been squashed one way or the other, whether we've just figured it out in our minds or we've seen it in our life. Samson is there to fight and say, look, we can take out those Philistines. We didn't need that in the first place. We can conquer no matter what, because Samson's working from a place, a desire to do the right thing. Amen.